Hey everyone, my name is Tiffany Lashmet. I'm an Extension Agricultural Law Specialist with Texas A&M AgriLife Extension, and I'm excited today to visit with you about the topic of agricultural leases. This is an area where I get a lot of questions. A lot of folks are interested in this topic. I think we've got some useful information today, and I'm going to also point you to some great resources to give you additional information if this is a topic that's of interest to you. I'll start off with my usual disclaimer. It basically says I'm a lawyer, but I'm not your lawyer. So I can sure give you general information today. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have after this presentation. You can contact me. I'll give you my info. But I can't give anybody specific legal advice. So if you need specific advice, if you need someone to draft a document or review a document, that's beyond the scope of what I'm allowed to do in my role at Texas A&M, and you'll need to contact your own attorney. So here's just a quick roadmap of kind of what we're going to cover today. We're going to start out and talk a little bit about whether written leases are required. Then we're going to talk about calculating payment. That's a big question people have, is how do we structure the payment and how much should I be either charging or paying depending on which side of the fence you are on. Then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about pointers for kind of the three main agricultural leases. So we'll talk through what I sort of deem the top three things to consider for grazing, hunting, and farm leases. So we'll do that. And then, like I said, we'll wrap it up with a list of additional resources that I think that you'll find really useful. So let's start with our first section. Is a written lease required? I think it's a good question to ask, right? Because when you look at a lot of farm leases or grazing leases, they sort of look like this picture, right? Two guys standing in the pasture. One of them says, yeah, I'll lease it to you for X amount. They shake hands and go on their way. Right? How many of you guys have leases like that? I'm sure some of you probably do. I know that it's pretty standard, but let's talk about it from a legal standpoint. Is that verbal lease, right, made in the pasture, is that valid under Texas law? Is that a valid contract? I'm going to teach you how lawyers answer every question, and that is with it depends, okay? So essentially, the way the law works in Texas is generally we assume that a verbal contract is valid. However, there are certain situations under something called the statute of frauds where a lease or a contract has to be in writing in order to be legally enforceable. And if you look at this list here, the second bullet that's in bold says a lease of real estate for a year or more has to be in writing to be legally enforceable. And so if you're going to have a multi-year lease, right, a 2, 3, 5-year lease, it's really critical you have that in writing from a legal standpoint, right? So that's a legally valid contract. And the reason it matters if it's a legally valid contract is if there's a dispute and you need to go to court over this lease, probably the claim you're going to want to make is breach of contract. Guess what the first thing a judge looks for when they have a breach of contract case is? A contract, right? And so that's a really important thing. So for sure, if you've got a multi-year lease, you need to make sure that that's put into writing. I would argue you should have all of your leases put into writing for a couple of reasons that we'll look at next. One thing I will say on this, and I get pushback on this, we'll talk a little bit more about my dad here in a few minutes. But my dad used to push back on me and say, well, if we, to make our neighbors sign a written lease, he'll think we don't trust him. And I understand where that's a concern, but truthfully, I think that you can approach this not from a lack of trust or something that would damage the relationship, but actually the opposite, right? Something that can make sure that you're protecting that relationship between the two parties, right? All a lease is sitting down, thinking through kind of the what ifs, right? What could happen? What could you want to do? What could I want to do? How could this, how could there be an issue? And let's just agree on how we're going to address it now. It doesn't have to be some sort of adversarial process. It can really just be a way to work through any sort of what might happen and make sure everybody's on the same page. So I hope that pep talk helps you feel a little bit more comfortable maybe in asking for those written leases. Okay. Another reason that it can be really important to have a written lease is there may be certain agencies that require proof of a lease. And of course, in order to give them proof of a lease, you need to have a written lease. So one place where this comes up a lot for rural landowners is at the FSA, which is Farm Service Agency, or NRCS office, so Natural Resource Conservation Service. Essentially, you guys probably know this, but I know that this is, there might be some new landowners in the group. So in case you don't, these two agencies are part of the USDA, and they administer a lot of the different government programs that are available to rural landowners. So things like CRP and under Title I of the Farm Bill, you might qualify for ARC or PLC payments. Some of the ad hoc programs that have been available over the last year or so. Regardless, the way it works at the FSA and the NRCS office is if you need to go in and sign up for a program and you're using leased land as part of that, they'll require a copy of the lease. And we'll talk in a little bit about why they require that. But obviously, in order to have give them a lease, you got to have a written lease. So that's one place it can come up. Another issue that I think is particularly big in the part of the state where you guys are located is the county appraisal district may require a copy of a written lease if you're using that lease to justify your open space property tax valuation, right? And you want to make sure you keep that open space valuation. And so they may need a copy of a lease for their records. So that's another place where that written lease may be important. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is that you just never know what might happen. I mean, I can bore you with legal jargon and technicalities on why we need written leases. I'm not sure that just shooting straight with you isn't the best. So one thing I'll say here, I'm going to use this picture to sort of describe the situation. My dad is on the bay horse in the denim shirt. Okay, he's been involved in agriculture his entire life. He's been a landowner. He's been a tenant. He just gets it. Okay, if you have an oral or verbal lease with him, you're probably going to be okay. The guy on the gray horse there is my city boy cousin from Switzerland. He came over for Thanksgiving. This was his first time on the horse, and he went home and told everybody he rode Seabiscuit, right? And you can look at that horse there. His name is Sarge. He hasn't run a step since the 80s, okay? Here's my point, though. My dad gets it. But heaven forbid something happens to my dad, and the land gets inherited by my Swiss cousin. And now, if I'm leasing that land, I have a landowner who doesn't have a clue what's going on. Right? He doesn't understand what's normal. He doesn't know what we do around here. He doesn't understand, what's common in the industry, whether we're talking about haying or livestock or farming. He just doesn't know. And in that scenario, I really want to make sure as the tenant that I have a written lease so that my rights are protected. Okay? And I think it's true on the flip side as well. So let's think about this. If you're somebody who owns land and you are leasing it out, okay, or you own land and you think at some point when your kids inherit it, they might want to lease it out. Okay, if those kids are absentee landowners, right, maybe they don't live nearby. Maybe they don't know, the people who you might look to lease to. Maybe they don't know what terms should be included in a lease. It could be really beneficial for you as the landowner who does know these things, right, to draft up that lease, have it in writing, and that way when your kids inherit the land, that's one less thing that they have to deal with. So really important. And if you look at the statistics, right, the number of acres that are going to change hands in the next 20 years or so, given the current kind of age of rural landowners in America, this is going to be a huge issue. So I think really important to have those leases in writing. I really encourage that. I always tell people, it doesn't have to be adversarial. I said that before. Do you need to use a lawyer? Maybe, right? I hate to come in here and say, no, don't use a lawyer. But what I would say is I think that there are a lot of resources here that would let you at least get a good start on your own. We've got checklists we're going to show you. We've got sample lease language I'm going to talk to you about. There's lots of good resources. I always recommend at least having something reviewed by an attorney before you sign it. But I do think that there's a way here that both parties could sit down together, hammer this out, and sure be better off than you are with nothing in place. Okay, so that's my pitch for why we should have our leases in writing. Let's talk next about calculating payment. This is one of the most common questions I get is how do we structure payment in a lease and how much should I charge or pay, right, from a landowner or a tenant? For ag leases, there are sort of three lease arrangements that are the most common. The first is the simplest and by far the most common is the cash lease, right? So that's where we just have a set amount you pay to lease the property. Generally, that's going to either be done on a per acre basis. Sometimes you'll see a per head basis if you've got people grazing livestock, so many dollars per head. You might also just see a flat fee, right? Like maybe it's going to be $5,000 for this lease for the year. But regardless, it's a cash lease. You agree on an amount and it gets paid. All right. So again, most common, simplest. A crop share lease is something where you guys are, again, you're probably familiar with this, but basically you've got the landowner and the tenant who are going to share in certain expenses, and then they're also going to share in the income from the crop. Generally, I'd say we see this more commonly with a row crop type situation, right? If you're growing corn or cotton or sorghum or something like that. You can do this on a livestock lease. It's just not quite as common. So what you'll see here, for example, right, is let's say we're going to do a lease on the thirds. And so the landowner will get 1/3 of the income. The tenant will get 1/3 of the income. And then they'll also share in certain costs, 1/3, 2/3. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The last type of lease sort of combines the two. And these are rare, but you see them pop up from time to time. And they're either called a flex lease or a hybrid lease, same thing. What you see here sometimes is you'll have a base rate that is set, so sort of a cash lease rate. So let's say that the rate is $20 an acre, okay? And then if I'm growing corn, maybe I'll say if the price of corn gets above, I used to use $5, but we're above that now. So let's say if the price of corn gets above $5.50, the lease is going to flex higher, right? So maybe I'll owe an extra 50 cents an acre, however you want the numbers to work out, okay? But basically there's an external factor. Usually it's either yield or it's price that's going to flex that lease amount up or down. Okay, so that's another way to structure the lease. As you might imagine, the key there is you've really got to spell out those details and make sure everybody's on the same page about when it flexes, what's required, those sort of things to make sure everybody understands the agreement. Okay, one other thing I want to say on structuring the lease is you need to keep in mind that your choice here, right, how we structure the payment under your lease can affect you other places. So that's going to be things like at the FSA office, right? We talked about the Farm Service Agency. Under those programs, who gets paid depends on how you structured that lease. It can be an issue with the IRS when it comes to self-employment taxes. It can be an issue with Social Security when you're looking at income. How you structure those may affect those other things. And so I really advise people, if you're looking at entering into a new lease, or if you're looking at changing the structure of a current lease, visit with your accountant before you do that, just to make sure there's not going to be unforeseen issues that pop up in these different areas. Okay, finally, how much should you charge? I'm going to lawyer you again and tell you that really depends on the facts, right? I'm going to give you numbers. I'm going to give you some statistics, but understand that it really depends on the factual situation, right? These statistics don't take into account the quality of the fence or if there's water or the amount or quality of forage, right? There's too many ifs to go into it. Also, there's things like, you know, how close is it to your existing place? I'll tell you right now, we have one lease that we're vastly overpaying for. It's across the road from my house. I can look out the window and check on the cows, right? That's worth something to me. So just keep in mind, it does really depend on the facts. What I always recommend, again, I'm going to give you numbers. I always recommend you talk to people on the ground in your area who are doing this, because flat out, they're a better source of information than these reports I'm going to show you. Okay, so talk to your county extension agents. Texas A&M also has range specialists. So if you need somebody to talk through with you, you know, analyzing how much forage you have or the quality of your forage or things like that, we've got range specialists who can help with that. Talk to other landowners or tenants in your area, right? See what they're paying, see what kind of the going rate is. That information is really valuable when you're looking at trying to figure this out. Okay, now there are some numbers I'm going to give you from the government. The first thing I'm going to talk about is a survey that's done by the USDA National Ag Statistics Service. They do this survey every year of people who are involved in agricultural leases, and their results, right, are based on the survey responses that they get in. And so for 2020, they've got statewide averages for Texas. Now, keep in mind, right, Texas is a huge state. And so I don't find the statewide average all that helpful because there's a big difference, right, between like far west Texas and East Texas and the Panhandle and the Valley. However, I'm going to give you the numbers and then we're going to break it down and get you a little closer to home. So statewide average for Texas, pasture land was $7 an acre. All of these numbers we're going to look at are going to be on a per acre per year basis. All right, per acre per year. If you wanted to do something else, right, like a per head type charge, you'd have to kind of back into that mathematically and figure out what that would look like. Okay. Non-irrigated cropland statewide average is $30 an acre a year, and irrigated cropland average $95 an acre a year. Okay, so let's drill down into this and get us a little bit closer to your area. Okay, so your counties, both of them, Freestone and Leon, are in the East Texas South region, which you'll see is number 52 on this map that we have here. And the averages for that region for 2020 were pasture land 1150, non-irrigated cropland 1850, and irrigated cropland 7250. Okay, so again, per acre per year, that's the average for that region. They also break it down by county. And so for Leon County, they've got information on non-irrigated cropland. They say $12.50, pasture land $13. And again, these are just based on the survey responses that they get. So if they're not accurate, that's just because the survey responses weren't accurate, right? They weren't an accurate representation. I'll tell you just in general, over the years, having presented on this for about 6 or 7 years now, most people tell me they're a little bit low. And that's kind of a statewide thing. These numbers seem low to people. For what that's worth, that's just anecdotal. But again, that's where talking to other people in the area, talking to your county extension agent can be really useful. Freestone County only reported pasture land and it was at $9.10 an acre. And so what that means is they just didn't get enough responses on the other types to have any sort of statistically significant data that they could use. Okay, that's the information from USDA National Ag Statistics Service. Now there's a website they've got, there's a database you can go dig into if you want to find this information for any county in America. It's there. It can be a little bit cumbersome to use. If anybody wants that info, I'm sure glad to send you an email with a link to that database and you can dig around in other counties. I'll also offer, if you want me to pull information for you from other counties, if you'll shoot me an email, I'll pull that and send it your way. Okay, so that's USDA NASS. The second report that I think is really great here in Texas is called the Texas Rural Land Value Trends. It's put out every year by this is a mouthful, the Texas Society of the American Society of Farm Managers and Rural Appraisers. Basically, it's in a group of rural appraisers who get together and publish this, sort of letting people know what the land trends will look like in Texas. Super useful. We're looking at the 2019 version just because the 2020 version hasn't come out yet. They always publish it a year behind, right? So in general, it's come out in April in years past, so it should be out anytime. Keep an eye out for it. You can just look on their website. You can Google this topic. The other thing is, as soon as it comes out, I'll make sure and have a blog post on it on my blog. I'll give you that information at the end of the program. But essentially what they do here is they break the county into 7 regions. Sorry, I'm going to say that again. They break Texas into 7 regions. Okay, and then within each region, they break it into 5 or 6 kind of sub-regions. So you've got kind of little clusters of counties, anywhere from maybe 3 counties up to maybe, 10 or 12 in a little cluster. And for each one of those, they really break down the different, not only lease rates, but also sales rates or land value for those areas. So I'm going to show you, okay, Region 5, Leon County is in Region 5. You'll see up here on the very north end of this map. And so this is Region 5, right? All of these. And then the little clusters I mentioned, you can see in the different shades of blue. Okay. Leon County is in what the kind of sub-region they call the Brazos Bottom. And if you come over here to the chart, you can see for the Brazos Bottom, they break land into different categories. They've got irrigated cropland, dry cropland, improved and native pasture, and then rural or residential ag, 50 to 100 acres. Okay. If you look here, you can see the rental range. All right. So for irrigated cropland in Leon County, they show 90 to 130. For dryland cropland, they show 60 to 110. And for improved and native pasture, they show 15 to 25. Okay. Now, if you look at those, the one here that jumps out at me as being really different from the NASS survey is that dryland cropland. Because for Leon County, NAS said it was something like 1850, and this says 60 to 110. So again, use it for what it's worth, right? But understand there can be some variation in these statistics. You'll also see here there are different value ranges, which I think those are really helpful if you're looking at purchasing property or selling property, right? So improved and native pasture, for example, shows 3,000 to 11. I'm sure that's supposed to be 11,000, but that's a typo in their information. Anyway, really useful resource. That's the info for Leon County. I pulled Freestone County as well. You'll see Freestone County is over here in kind of this ugly brownish colored subregion called the Central Blacklands. They break it into more categories here. We've got dry cropland good, dry cropland marginal, improved pasture, native pasture open, native pasture wooded, and then river properties. And again, you'll see these rental ranges here that you can check out as well. So like I say, I think it's a really useful resource. It's something that I refer to a lot. It at least hopefully gives you a ballpark when you're trying to figure out what you might be needing to charge. Okay, so our next section, like I said, I sort of went to our checklist and just pulled out 3 topics for each of the main leases, grazing, hunting, and farm leases, for us to hit on today. Now listen, if you look at the checklist that we're going to talk about in the resources section, there's like 8 or 9 pages worth of checklists. So we could be here all day on one of these. I just pull out kind of the high notes that I think are worth us discussing in our time today. So let's talk about grazing leases first. The number one thing you need to think about in a grazing lease is setting a stocking rate. Okay, and this is a good point to remember here too. So a stocking rate, all right, is just simply saying how many head of livestock can be on the property, right? So I might tell them, look, you can run 20 cows, right? Or you can run so many stocker calves, okay? How many animals can be on the property? I have here, the landowner is going to want this term, a tenant may not. And so here's how I'll describe this to you. If I'm a landowner, if I'm writing a lease for a landowner, this to me is the most important term I can put in the lease. And the reason for that, right, is the landowner really needs to make sure that they're protecting the forage on that property. Because the last thing you want to happen is somebody to come in, right, put every cow they've ever seen on your land, way overstock it, way overgraze it, and then you're left with this land when they leave, and the grass is about like the carpet here on my floor, and you can't do anything with it. Okay, so it's a really important term for a landowner. If I'm writing a lease as a tenant, I'm probably not fighting for this term. Okay, I'll agree to it if it's reasonable, but I'm not going to be the one who's like, oh, let's make sure we set a stocking rate, right? Because it behooves me to be able to put more livestock on the property. Now, if you're a good tenant, like I hope I am, we certainly don't overgraze, right? We want to take care of that property. We want to make sure we can try to hold that lease for a long time. However, I'm flagging this for you because I think the bigger thing to think about is if you're looking at one of these checklists or one of these sample leases you can get online, you need to ask yourself, right? Is this a term that really applies to our situation, first of all? And then second of all, is this a term that's helpful to me? And if I'm the one who's kind of proposing terms, I'm going to think pretty hard about whether or not this is a term I want to have included or not. So again, just keep that in mind. Okay, another thing you want to think about when you're setting a stocking rate is the size of the animals. What I mean by that is, if I say, let's say you're going to run stocker calves, and I say you can run 50 on the property. If I'm thinking about 400-pound wean calves and you show up with 800-pound, calves ready to go to the feed yard, we may have a problem, right? Because we weren't on the same page. Same thing can happen with cows, right? Lots of variation in sizes of cows. Obviously, bigger cows eat more forage. That may impact that. So one thing to think about there is instead of saying, you can have 20 head, maybe I say you can have 20 animal units. And an animal unit essentially is a measurement, and 1,000 pounds of animal is one animal unit. Okay, so for a cow, if she weighs 1,000 pounds, that's one animal unit. If she weighs 1,500 pounds, that's 1.5 animal units. Okay, and that will help us sort of deal with this issue of the size of the cattle because it automatically takes into account their size with this animal unit measurement. All right, so think about that as well. The other big thing here is that this number may need to change based on drought or on wildfire. This, I think, is particularly important if you've got a long-term lease, right? So if I'm going to do one of these 3-year leases, 5-year leases, 10-year leases, the stocking rate we need today may be really different 2 years from now, right? So you want to make sure you've got some mechanism in there to kind of revisit that in case situations change, okay? So another thing, again, just keep that in mind as you're thinking about setting that stocking rate. Another major issue, and frankly, this really applies to all 3 of the different lease types, but is what can be done on the property. What I always tell people is if you don't have limitations written in your lease, you can probably assume they don't exist, right? So if I lease somebody my land and I just say, yeah, I'll lease it to you, and I think he's going to run cattle, but the next thing I know, he's got cattle out there and his kids roping horses and the kids are out there every weekend riding 4-wheelers. That may not be what I intended, but I didn't spell that out. So you need to really spell out what these leases are for. So if you want to do a grazing lease and you want to really limit what they can do, you may want to say this is for grazing cattle only, right? They have the right to do this specific activity on the property. Are there any areas that are off limits to the tenant? Right, maybe he can use the pasture, but you don't want him to use the corrals or something like that. Okay, are there any requirements for what they have to do? Right, sometimes you'll see people that require fertilizing or require spraying weeds or things like that. Maybe the opposite's true. Right? Maybe we want to prohibit any pesticide use on the property. Again, just think about what you want and make sure you really spell that out. Okay, the last thing on this note, I say save yourself a tense situation in November. That's because opening weekend of deer season hits about the first weekend of November every year. And this can be a real issue if you've leased your land out, because I always tell people, anybody who's ever set foot on that property is going to have some cockamamie theory for why they should be the one who gets to hunt there, right? And so you want to address this when we're sitting across the table with pencils in our hands and not when everybody's standing across the fence with guns. So what I would tell you is if you're going to lease your property for grazing or farming or haying or whatever, make sure that you address whether or not that includes hunting rights. If it does, fine, spell out what they can hunt, when they can hunt, anything like that. If it doesn't, if you're going to reserve those hunting rights for yourself or you're going to lease them to somebody else, again, really spell that out in the lease so that everybody's on the same page. Okay, the last thing I want to hit on with grazing leases is maintenance of fixed assets. This can be a real issue. So who's going to maintain or repair any fixed assets during the lease? These are going to be things like fences, corrals, barns, windmills or water well pumps, things like that. Who's going to be in charge of maintaining or repairing those? It doesn't matter how you do this. There's no right or wrong way. You just want to make sure you understand what the agreement is and that you both agree to it. So I'll give you an example. And at least in our part of the world, a lot of times what you'll see is the tenant will pay for the labor and the landowner will pay for the materials, right? So if a fence needs repaired, landowner buys the stuff, tenant either pays for or provides the labor. Again, that's not right or wrong. It's just an example of how that can be done. Okay. On the concept of fences, make sure that you require periodic inspection and immediate repair of damage on a fence if you're a landowner, okay? And this is just because if something happens, right, if cattle get out and get hit by a car and everybody gets sued, this can be a good thing for a landowner to say, listen, in the lease, it was clear that was a responsibility of the tenant, okay? So from a landowner perspective, that can be a really useful term, okay? We're not going to dive into liability today. That's a topic I usually spend an hour or an hour and a half on alone. But I will tell you from a liability standpoint, generally during a lease, the landowner isn't liable for injuries that occur. Okay. That's a general rule. Landowner not liable during the lease. There are some exceptions. Okay. One of those is if you agree to make repairs and don't, or if you agree to make repairs and then do a poor job and that causes injury, okay, you can be liable for that. So again, from a landowner perspective, if you're agreeing to do any sort of repairs or maintenance, make sure you do them and do them well, okay? The last thing I'll say on that, again, I have a soapbox I can get up to on this, but if you're a landowner or if you're a tenant, you really need to have liability insurance for any property where you're leasing it out. And this is particularly important, right? Because I say here that generally the landowner is not going to be liable for those injuries. That doesn't mean the landowner might not be named in a lawsuit, right? And so you have to then, hire a lawyer to come help you get the lawsuit dismissed, get you out of it. That costs money, right? They're expensive. And you also, if you don't have insurance, you don't have that cushion of knowing you've got policy limits to help cover any judgment or settlement. Okay. And keep in mind, if you've got liability insurance, they provide you a defense if there's a covered claim made, right? So if somebody gets hurt on my leased land, the first phone call I make is my insurance company. They hire me a lawyer on their dime to get me out of the case. All right. So just keep that in mind. Okay, let's hit our top 3 hunting lease pointers. Again, we could talk for an hour on the different things to include, but here's kind of the highlights. The first thing for a hunting lease I think is really important is to try to address some of those liability issues. And because of that, you want to have everyone who's coming on the property sign the hunting lease and sign some waivers or releases of liability. Okay? So sometimes, a lot of times, I think what happens is, let's say I lease my land to Justin. Justin signs the lease, right? He's bound by the terms of the lease. But then if he shows up to hunt with 5 of his buddies and none of them have signed the lease, they're not bound by those terms, right? And so if they do something to breach the lease, I can't sue for breach of contract, right? I can't enforce the lease against people who weren't a party to it. So I really recommend anybody who's going to come on your place as part of a lease for hunting, make sure that they also sign that contract, okay? It's a good idea to make sure, if you want to enforce this, have a term that says anybody who's going to come on the property has to be approved in writing by the landowner. Okay, from a landowner perspective, that does a couple of things. The first thing is it lets me know who's going to be on my property, right? Just in general. If there's somebody who I don't want out there for whatever reason, I can deal with that. The second thing it does, though, is it lets me make sure that I've got my paperwork in order, right? So if I know people are coming, I can make sure that I have them sign the lease. I can make sure that I have them sign the waivers. So just a good term to include. On the topic of waivers, again, we could talk about this for an hour. I always, if you want to be like belt suspenders, we've got every potential defense option available. I would have everybody sign a standard waiver of liability, just a regular waiver of liability or release of liability, same thing, okay? I would use a lawyer to draft that. The law on that's tricky enough, and courts are pretty particular about those. I would use a lawyer to get a good waiver drafted, okay? And in general, courts will enforce those in Texas, okay? If they're done right, if they're done in accordance with the law. The second thing I would have them sign is there's some statutory language, release language in the Texas Agritourism Act. That act provides some additional protections for landowners if you either hang up a sign or have them sign this waiver. So again, I think it's worth pulling that paragraph out of the Agritourism Act, have that signed as kind of a second waiver defense option. Okay, and again, I would have everybody coming on the property do that. Okay, here are just a few kind of hunting specific considerations. Can people use tree stands, deer blinds, and feeders? Lots of conflict about this comes up, okay? Can they use them? Where can they put them? How can they attach them? How long can they be there? All right, so make sure you spell that out in the lease. There's just lots of fights about that, I feel like, every year. Are there any types of weapons that are prohibited, right? Sometimes people will say, well, we'll let people come and do bow hunting. We're not going to let them come and shoot with a rifle or whatever. Dogs can be an issue. Can they use hunting dogs or not? Can ATVs be used on the property? That can be a huge issue. From a liability standpoint, ATV accidents are one of the #1 causes of claims made for injuries during hunting. So again, I'm not saying yes or no. I'm just saying make sure you address that if it's an issue. Okay. Another thing that I think is really good if you've got livestock on the property is to think about having a liquidated damages clause. Here's my picture to go along with that. Liquidated damages, it basically means we agree up front, if livestock is killed or injured, here's how much you're going to pay me. Okay, what we want to avoid is we got a cow that gets shot. The hunter says, well, I'm going to pay you $800. That's what she's worth at the sale barn. And you're thinking she probably was going to have a calf that was going to win Denver and she's worth $80,000. And we've got a fight in the middle. Liquidated damages just basically says, look, we agree if you kill or injure an animal, here's what the penalty is going to be. Here's what you're going to pay me for damages. I think that can be a really good idea. Okay, this picture makes me laugh. I saw it on Facebook a couple of years ago and it said, ranchers getting ready for hunting season. And unfortunately, there's a lot of times where people shoot livestock while they're hunting. So it's a real issue. It did make me laugh though, because they spray painted a cow here and that's a bull. So I thought that was comical. The last thing you might think about for as far as hunting specific considerations is you could ask for a security deposit. I think this is important, especially if you don't know the people, right? I mean, if I'm leasing to my neighbor, I'm not making him pay a security deposit, right? But if it's somebody I don't know, they can do a security deposit or they put money down, right? And they'll get it back so long as there's not any sort of damage, nothing's torn up, etc. So you can think about that as well. We talked about these limited liability statutes. Take a look at those. There's lots of information on that. I'm going to give you the additional resources later. There are some statutes that can protect you though. That Agritourism Act, the Texas Recreational Use Statute's really good. Make sure you look at those because there's some additional protections. Okay, a couple of other things you see in hunting leases. A lot of times people will address open flames, right? Or whether or not you're allowed to have any open flame or fire. Use of alcohol sometimes is addressed, those sort of details. Just think through those. And again, we've got checklists with more information. The last one, this is really similar to what we talked about before. Describe the lease property and limitations. So for hunting especially, I think it's a really good idea to have a really clear map that lets people know, here's where you're allowed to be, here's where you're not, right? So a lot of times I say, print one off of Google Maps, right? You can go to Google Earth and print a map and then highlight, right? Here's where you can hunt. Also good to mark things like, here's the house, don't shoot this way. Or here's this old abandoned well you might not see. From a liability perspective, warning people of those hidden dangerous conditions can be really important as well. You may want to address where the property can be entered. That's particularly important if you're going to have multiple hunters coming out, right, on the land. Kind of having one point of entry, one point of exit may be a good idea. Is anybody else going to have rights? So again, this comes back to if I'm going to lease my land for hunting, but I also lease it for grazing and I have different tenants, I need to tell them about each other, right? What I don't want is one of them running the other one off thinking they're doing me a favor, right? And then we talked about the security deposit being a potential option as well. Okay, lastly, let's talk about the kind of the top 3 for farm leases. And then, like I said, we're going to talk about some additional resources as well. The first thing is for a crop share lease, okay? If you're going to structure your lease as a crop share or as a flex, right? You need to make sure you really spell out those details. And we mentioned this before, but it's really important. Okay, so if we've got a lease on the thirds, right, we know that means that the landowner is going to pay for 1/3 of the input costs and the tenant pays for 2/3. But you really want to spell out what costs are you sharing, because you don't want a situation where the landowner thought it meant one thing, the tenant thought the other, and we've got a big dispute in the middle of the growing season. In general, costs that increase yields are going to be shared proportionally with the income share. So like fertilizer, for example, historically fertilizer would be a shared cost, right? Tenant pays 1/3, the other guy, I said it backwards. The landowner pays 1/3, the tenant pays 2/3 of the fertilizer cost. But list that out, right? There's fertilizer costs, irrigation costs, seed costs, pesticide costs, harvesting costs. Just make sure you're clear on what costs are included in that share. Okay, another issue that comes up. What say does the landowner have in activities that are going to increase his or her costs? This came up for me a couple years ago. I met with somebody who was wanting to change from a cash lease to a crop share lease on land that she owned, but she was really adamant that she didn't have a big budget for this. And if the tenant was going to be spraying fertilizer 3 times a year, she wasn't going to be paying for that. So you need to really address, right? Like, can they have some say in how many applications are going to be done of different herbicides or fertilizers or pesticides? Are they going to have a say in, things like how much water you're going to run, how often you're going to run the pivot, things like that? Again, I'm not saying there's a right or wrong, but I'm saying I've seen it become an issue, so you may want to discuss that as well. Another issue that can come up here is, what sort of documentation does the tenant provide to the landowner in order to show what amount is due, and when is the payment going to be required? All right, so for example, let's say we've got a tenant who leases 5 places and he shows up with a bill from the co-op for fertilizer. Is that good enough for me as a landowner? Or am I going to want to know somehow like what fertilizer was applied on my field, that this was for my field? It's not just the entire bill that I'm paying a third of for all 5 of his places. Okay. And then once I get those receipts, when do I need to make sure I have paid by? Spell out those deadlines. Again, just try to avoid a situation later. Okay, the next issue for a farm lease is, what about growing crops after the lease ends? And you would be shocked at how often this comes up in the world. So we learned about it in law school, and I guess I thought it was kind of theoretical, but it comes up all the time. In your lease, you want to address what happens to any standing crops in the field when the lease ends. Okay, so again, in our part of the world, right, we plant cotton. Generally, it should be out of the field by the end of December. Sometimes there are wet years and you may not have your cotton out for some reason. Let's say we still have a cotton crop standing on January 1st. The lease is over. At the end of December 31, the lease is over. What happens to that standing crop? You need to address that in your lease, because the law on this, there's a provision we'll talk about. It's not a silver bullet, be all end all. So I really recommend address that in your lease. What's going to happen to already growing crops? If you don't address it, there is something in the law, it's common law, which basically means this is like judge-made law in cases. There's not a statute on this. It's called the doctrine of implements. And basically the doctrine of implements says, if you meet 3 requirements, we're going to allow a tenant to still access the property and harvest the crop, even though the lease already ended. Okay, the 3 requirements are: the lease has to be for an uncertain duration. The termination had to be because of either an act of God or the landlord. It was not the fault of the tenant that the lease terminated. And then the crop had to be planted during the right of occupancy. Where this becomes a problem is that requirement that the lease had to be for an uncertain duration. So if I had a lease that was a year long, right, let's just say January 1st to December 31st, that's not an uncertain duration. And if I've got that growing crop issue, I can't rely on the doctrine of implements. Again, why you want to address it in your lease instead. Okay. Now, let's say I had a lease and it was, okay, they're going to lease it to me from January 1st to December 31st. But the lease says in there, if the property sells during the term of the lease, your lease terminates. That would be an uncertain duration. Okay. If somebody bought that land in August, now I may be able to rely on the doctrine of implements. Still better off to have it spelled out in the lease, but at least that's how that would apply. Okay. The last thing, and this can be way complicated. I'm going to try not to get in the weeds on you, but we mentioned this earlier, that how you structure a lease is going to govern how you're paid for government programs at the FSA or the NRCS office. Okay. You want to look on your property at how those government program payments are going to be divided. The example I have here is talking about ARC and PLC. Okay. That's a farm program payments under Title I of the Farm Bill. And basically, if you have base acres assigned to your land, you can qualify for a payment if you enroll in one of these programs. Here's how the FSA office is going to pay. Okay. If there is a cash lease, the tenant gets the payments. So whether it's ARC PLC or other program payments, if there's a cash lease, program payments go to the tenant. If it's a share lease, then the parties are going to share in the payments the same as other income. Okay, so we've got a lease on the thirds and we get a payment from ARC or PLC, the landowner gets a third, the tenant gets 2/3. Okay, On a flex lease, it's going to depend on the details, depending on how you have that structured. It may be that there's a share situation between the parties, but it depends, and that the office would have to look at that. Okay? Now, that's how FSA is going to pay, no matter what. They pay that way. But the parties could agree amongst themselves to do something different. So let me give you an example. Let's say that I've got land that I'm leasing out as pasture, but it's got wheat base with it. Okay. So maybe I lease it for $10 an acre, but I get a ARC or a PLC payment, right? Because of the wheat base. The tenant, if it's a cash lease, right? $10 an acre, the tenant would get that payment, and it might be more than the $10 they're paying. In other words, they could potentially profit from the lease. That's where, as a landowner, you want to know, right, what programs is your property eligible for, and you may want to either adjust the amount you're charging or enter into an agreement with the tenant where you split or something, address that payment. This may not be an issue for you, but it's at least something to be aware of, and it might be worth looking into. Okay. So lastly, our last section here is just some additional resources on leases and then on ag law in general that hopefully will be helpful. From the lease standpoint, there's a great website called Ag Lease 101. It's particularly good information for farm leases. So if you go there, there's going to be articles, there's checklists, there's sample lease languages. If you're looking at a farm lease or a row crop type lease, I think they've got really great information. Okay, so Ag Lease 101 is one resource. We've got an online class called the Online Ranchers Agriculture Leasing Workshop. It's essentially this presentation, but spread out over 3 hours. So we go into a lot more depth. We spend a lot of time talking about liability and liability protection. We just go into more detail, basically. If you're interested in that, it's available on demand anytime. And you can find out more information if you go to agrilife.learn.tamu.edu. That's the address there on the bottom, AgriLifeLearn. Okay. And if you look in the business and finance category, you'll find this online course. We've also got a handbook. It's called the Ranchers Agriculture Leasing Handbook. And it basically is just a handbook for tenants and landowners on drafting a lease. So there's chapters on how to set a lease rate, why leasing is useful. There's checklists, there's sample lease language, lots of great information there. You can download that for free. If you want a free PDF, you just go to the Texas Agriculture Law blog. You'll see a tab that says published materials. You can get it for free. If you want to order a hard copy, we have those available, but we have to charge to cover shipping and printing. You can contact my assistant if you'd like a hard copy of that handbook as well. Okay. Another handbook that I've got that might be of interest to you guys, it's called Owning Your Piece of Texas, Key Laws Texas Landowners Need to Know. Essentially, I sat down and wrote this handbook for rural landowners, okay, to talk to you about here's, 12 or 13 laws you need to be aware of. So we do everything from fence law to water law to liability to energy leases. Lots of good info there. Again, if you want a free PDF, it's on my website. You can go download that. If you'd like a hard copy, my assistant has those and can help you get one of those ordered. Okay, so that's a resource as well. I've mentioned this a couple of times. This is where you can download the handbooks. It's my website. It's the Texas Agriculture Law blog. You can Google that. It'll pop up, or here's the websites. Okay. I basically just post ag law info there. So about once a week, I do a post giving you an update on a new case or a new topic, or I've done a new checklist. Everything I do gets kind of warehoused here. So if you go there, there's one of those annoying pop-up boxes. I know. Okay. But if you put your email address in there and click subscribe, all of my posts will come to you just like an email from me. So you don't have to remember to go check it. It's just right there. Okay. And if you want those handbooks or any other handbooks, there's this tab right in the middle that says published materials. You click on that, and there's where you can get all your free PDFs. I've also got a podcast. So if you're a podcast listener, you can listen anywhere you listen to podcasts. Just look for Ag Law in the Fields. If you are not a podcast listener and you are interested in ag law, basically you just go to this website here at the top, aglaw.libsyn.com. You go there, and what you're going to find is about 103 episodes where I have done an audio interview with an ag lawyer on a different topic. All you have to do, you can scroll down, find a topic that you're interested in, push play, and you'll hear our audio interview for free. With 103 episodes, we've covered the gamut, including leases. There are episodes on grazing leases, hunting leases, livestock leases. So check those out if you're interested in that as well. Okay, and that's kind of my spiel. This last slide is basically my business card. If you're on social media, you can follow me on Twitter and Facebook. If you guys have questions, if you need additional information, if you want me to send you those PDFs and those handbooks, if you'd like a copy of my slides, shoot me an email or give me a call, and I'll sure be glad to help you however I can. So with that, it was great visiting with you today. Like I say, feel free to reach out if I can help you with anything else.